What if the United States entered a recession, triggering a domino effect that crushed entire countries? It may sound extreme, but the truth is that many nations are standing on the edge, relying heavily on the US for their economic survival. Some countries depend on American trade, while others have built their entire economies on US investments and exports. When the US stumbles, these countries could completely collapse. You might be shocked to discover which nations are teetering on the brink. Stay with us as we dive into the 10 countries that would face total collapse if the US enters a recession. Number 10. Mexico. You might assume Mexico is shielded from the effects of a US recession, but the reality is far more alarming. These two economies are deeply intertwined, with billions of dollars in trade exchanged every year. A sudden economic downturn in the US would devastate Mexico's economy. In 2023, approximately 80% of Mexico's exports went to the United States, with cars, electronics, and agricultural products leading the way. A drop in US consumer demand could send Mexico into a downward spiral, quickly resulting in rising unemployment and widespread poverty. But that's not all. Mexico has also become increasingly reliant on remittances from Mexican workers in the US. These remittances are a vital lifeline for many families. If wages in the US decline, the flow of money back home would slow to a trickle, leaving entire communities struggling to survive. The result could be a country pushed to the edge of collapse. Number 9. Canada. What if Canada's close economic relationship with the US became the very reason for its downfall? The United States is Canada's largest trading partner, with roughly 75% of Canadian exports heading south. If the US slips into a recession, Canada's economy would be in serious trouble. While you might think Canada could rely on its abundant natural resources, the truth is that oil prices are closely tied to American demand. A slowdown in the US economy would push oil prices down, severely impacting Canada's oil sector. This would likely lead to significant job losses and a potential crash in the housing market. Although Canada's strong social safety nets might offer some relief, the strain from a deep economic recession could trigger a broader financial crisis, leaving millions scrambling for stability. Without its ties to the US, could Canada survive? It's not very likely. Number 8. South Korea. Have you ever considered how vulnerable a tech giant like South Korea is to a US recession? The two economies are highly interconnected. South Korea is home to global powerhouses like Samsung and Hyundai, with a large portion of their exports heading directly to the United States. In 2023, over 14% of South Korea's GDP was derived from exports to the US, especially in the electronics and automotive industries. If the US economy were to falter, the demand for South Korean goods would decline rapidly. The semiconductor industry, South Korea's largest export sector, would be hit the hardest as American tech companies, major buyers of these chips, slash their budgets, and that would be just the beginning. The impact would ripple across the entire economy, causing massive job losses and widespread financial instability. Consumer confidence would collapse, triggering a domino effect that could plunge the country into crisis. Imagine a nation full of tech-savvy workers facing layoffs, stagnant wages, and rising inflation due to vanishing exports. South Korea's economic engine would stall, and the aftershocks would affect other East Asian economies that depend on its exports. Could South Korea survive a US recession? It's a ticking time bomb. Number 7. Brazil. What if Brazil, the largest economy in South America, could be brought to its knees by a US recession? You'd be surprised at how dependent Brazil is on American demand. Its exports to the US include soybeans, iron ore, and oil-critical components of its economy. When the US sneezes, Brazil catches a cold. In 2023, more than 20% of Brazil's exports went to the United States. Any major reduction in American demand would have catastrophic effects on Brazil's economy. Its agricultural sector, heavily reliant on US trade, would face a sharp decline in revenue. With unemployment already on the rise, such a downturn would worsen poverty and deepen inequality, but it doesn't end there. Brazil's government debt has reached alarming levels, making the country extremely vulnerable to external shocks. If the US enters a recession, global commodity prices would likely fall, severely impacting Brazil's oil exports. This could lead to inflation and widespread social unrest, with the Brazilian real weakening significantly. In a country already plagued by inequality and joblessness, an economic collapse could be devastating. Can Brazil survive such a shock? The outlook is highly uncertain. Number 6. India. What if India's massive outsourcing industry were to collapse because of a US recession? You might be shocked to learn just how dependent India is on the United States for economic stability. The country's booming tech and service industries rely heavily on American contracts. In fact, nearly 60% of India's IT sector revenue comes from the US, making it one of the most vulnerable sectors. If the US economy slows down, American companies would likely reduce their IT spending and cut back on outsourcing. That would directly impact India's job market, especially in tech hubs like Bengaluru and Hyderabad, where millions of jobs are tied to the sector. With less money flowing from the US, companies in India would be forced to cut salaries, lay off employees, and halt projects. The result? A massive economic crisis for millions of Indians, and there's more. India also heavily relies on remittances from its diaspora, many of whom work in the US. If the US enters a recession, these money transfers would dwindle, leaving families across India struggling to make ends meet. Could India handle this blow? Not likely, especially given its already fragile economic balance. Number 5. Turkey. Have you ever wondered how a US recession could devastate Turkey? The country's economy is already on shaky ground, facing high inflation and a weakening currency. Turkey is one of the most vulnerable nations to an economic collapse if the US experiences a downturn. Turkey's export market relies heavily on the United States, sending everything from textiles to machinery. A recession in the US would mean decreased demand for these products, putting Turkey's export-driven industries into a tailspin, but that's only the beginning. Turkey also depends on foreign investment to stay afloat. If a global recession occurs, American investors would likely pull their money out, leading to a rapid devaluation of the Turkish lira and pushing inflation even higher. Some might think Turkey's strategic location between Europe and Asia would shield it from economic shocks. However, its dependence on American trade, capital, and tourism makes it highly susceptible to financial chaos. If inflation spikes, unemployment rises, and public discontent boils over, Turkey could face a severe economic and political crisis. Can Turkey survive without its economic ties to the US? The answer remains uncertain. Number 6. Philippines. The Philippines, a Southeast Asian archipelago with deep historical and economic ties to the United States, would be significantly affected by a US economic collapse. With over $40 billion in remittances sent annually to the Philippines, almost a third of which comes from Filipino Americans working in the United States, a sudden downturn in the US economy would slash this critical lifeline. Millions of Filipino families rely on these funds to cover essentials like food, education, healthcare, and housing. In addition, the Philippine economy is heavily dependent on its exports to the United States, including electronics, garments, and agricultural products. A collapse in U.S. consumer demand would force Philippine exporters to shut down factories, triggering a rise in unemployment. The business process outsourcing BOE industry, another cornerstone of the economy, could also suffer as American companies cut operational costs, scaling down their outsourcing contracts. All of this would lead to increased poverty levels, budget deficits, and social unrest in the Philippines. Furthermore, given its strategic alliance with the U.S., a collapse would weaken the country's security umbrella in the South China Sea, further destabilizing the region. Number 7. Egypt. Egypt, the most populous country in the Arab world, would feel the tremors of a U.S. economic collapse across multiple sectors. The U.S. is not just a trade partner, but also one of Egypt's largest aid providers, offering more than $1.3 billion in military aid and hundreds of millions more in economic support annually. Should the US collapse economically, these financial flows would be disrupted, severely impairing Egypt's ability to maintain internal security and fund infrastructure projects. In addition, Egypt's tourism industry, which is slowly recovering and depends heavily on visitors from North America, would suffer dramatically as US tourists disappear overnight. More troubling is the domino effect such a collapse could have on the broader Middle East, where Egypt plays a stabilizing role. As American influence wanes, Egypt could face rising regional competition, currency devaluation, inflation, and increased public dissatisfaction, especially among the youth who already face high unemployment rates. The weakening of US-backed institutions would leave Egypt more vulnerable to extremism, political polarization, and instability in the Sinai and Nile Delta regions. Number 8. Kenya in Sub-Saharan Africa. Kenya stands out as one of the countries that would be hit hard by a U.S. economic collapse due to its deep reliance on trade, aid, and international development projects. Kenya receives hundreds of millions in U.S. development assistance focused on health, education, and agriculture, including critical funding for HIV or AIDS and malaria programs. A sudden end to this support would stretch Kenya's already overburdened public health infrastructure. Furthermore, Kenya's emerging technology sector, often referred to as Silicon Savannah, has attracted U.S. venture capital and partnerships. An economic collapse would dry up those investments and put startups and tech employment at risk. Kenya also exports horticultural products, textiles, and tea to the United States. With the collapsing U.S. economy, demand for these goods would plummet, hurting farmers and manufacturers alike. Add to that the depreciation of the Kenyan shilling, higher import costs for fuel and machinery, and shrinking tourism revenues, and Kenya could face a perfect storm of economic contraction, inflation, and social upheaval. Number 9. Vietnam. Vietnam's rapid economic ascent in recent years has been bolstered by trade with the United States, which is one of its largest export markets. Key Vietnamese exports like electronics, textiles, furniture, and footwear depend heavily on U.S. consumers and corporations. A U.S. economic collapse would cause mass cancellations of export orders, resulting in widespread factory closures and massive layoffs, especially among low-income laborers. Vietnam's GDP growth, which has remained among the highest in Asia, would suddenly stall or even reverse. Moreover, American foreign direct investment (FDI) in Vietnam spanning sectors such as manufacturing, energy, and technology would dry up, halting construction projects and reducing capital inflows. This disruption would cause currency instability, reduce government revenue, and strain the country's social safety net. Even Vietnam's informal economy, which benefits from remittances sent by Vietnamese immigrants living in the U.S., would see a sharp decline. In the broader geopolitical context, a U.S. collapse would diminish Washington's influence in Southeast Asia, giving regional rivals like China an opportunity to expand their presence and challenge Vietnam's sovereignty in the South China Sea. Number 10. Pakistan. Pakistan, already facing economic instability and political turbulence, would be thrust into a deeper crisis if the United States experienced a total economic collapse. Despite a complex bilateral relationship, Pakistan benefits from U.S. financial assistance, military aid, and significant trade flows, especially in textiles. With the U.S. unable to maintain its aid commitments or purchase Pakistani exports, Islamabad would face growing fiscal deficits, a balance of payments crisis, and potential currency freefall. Furthermore, Pakistan relies heavily on remittances from its diaspora, including a considerable number working in the United States. The loss of this income would severely impact families and reduce domestic consumption. A collapse of U.S. global influence would also reverberate through Pakistan's security environment. The weakening of American support for counterterrorism operations and regional diplomacy could exacerbate tensions with India and allow militant groups to regain ground. The compounded effects on public health, food security, energy imports, and governance could trigger mass protests and possibly a breakdown in civilian governance. setting the stage for deeper unrest or even a return to military dominance. As we've seen, the collapse of the United States economy would not be a localized crisis contained within its borders, it would be a global catastrophe with cascading effects across virtually every continent. From highly developed nations like Canada and South Korea to developing economies like the Philippines, Kenya, and Pakistan, the intricate web of financial dependencies, trade relationships, remittance flows, and geopolitical alignments tied to the United States makes its stability indispensable to the modern world order. The global economy is not just interconnected, it is interwoven with the very heartbeat of the American dollar, consumer demand, and diplomatic influence. In short, a U.S. economic collapse would not be the end of just one nation's prosperity, it could mark the beginning of a global regression into economic isolation, instability, and unrest. It serves as a powerful reminder of just how dependent our world has become on the economic and political engine that is the United States. While many countries are seeking to diversify their alliances and trade partners, the reality is that if America falls, much of the world falls with it.